In music, we have this type of score called an urtext. The point of the urtext is to return to the original score and really attempt to represent the initial intention of the composer, with little comments or notes by virtuosi to guide the player. The reason for this is that, over time, as a score is reinterpreted and reinterpreted according to aesthetic interests of successive time periods, and aspects of those interpretations are fused to the original form of the score, we end up no longer performing the composition as originally put to paper. It's more of a gross amalgamation of how it has been interpreted over time. So for me, the text is more than a document, just that facsimile. It's more a core philosophical underpinning of the score, the spirit of it. That purest essence that influences how we engage with the thing in itself, without all this baggage of how we engage with it in the past. So if you were to really think about it and trace back the design DNA of contemporary Denmaku to an text, where would you really put it? If you were generous, you were willing to make it more about concept, Space Invaders maybe, or should there be more meat to it, right? Xevious, right? Maybe you want to look a bit forward, maybe it begins with the toilet plane shot bomb configuration and flying shark. Me, personally, a cyber hermit, powerful internet contrarian, 3 a.m. word sayer, border down enthusiast. This game, dude. I put the source at Galaxian and then... Hear me out here, right? You're gonna think, well, what's this guy talking about? What the game wants you to do, the game wants you to go to get them, and then when you go fire on these guys, then these guys just show up, and then you're gonna want to move here, and then these guys show up, and you're gonna want to move here. If you watch Boghog's video on level design, which is really misleading because it's just Mark talking. Don't upload it to your channel, Bog. Upload it to Mark's channel.
The basic idea is to keep the player mobile by either spawning enemies on opposite sides of the screen or keeping one lane's worth of distance between each spawn.
And while I understand, its toilet plane does it a lot, I really don't like it because I feel like Galaga is where this really first pops up. And the way vertical games work with the screen appears there. So unlike Space Invaders, in Space Invaders the movement is marching down the screen. In Galaxian, at a certain point, the wave moves down, and the enemies fly in and out of formation, and they shoot at the player, right? So they fly, they're in a formation, and they fly out. In Galaga, these changes that are made in Galaxian, they're modified, they're added some variations to it, but the most important thing is that Galaga offers the challenging stages. The way these challenging stages work is that the enemies fly across the screen and they don't break formation, they don't leave formation, they just go in an arc and they leave. And this is a bug. This wasn't planned. And because this bug was so novel, they designed many patterns for it. And from this comes, the core of the arcade DNA, routing. Dealing with patterns that come in and out of the screen and trying to figure out how to work with them. Every game made after this takes this core of Galaga, these enemies flying on screen, being vulnerable, and then flying off screen, firing, and they combine it with these patterns of these challenging stages. And with successive games, many of these companies, Toaplan, Compile, Rising, they develop these pattern dynamics that are perfected finally in Cave's style, when all these companies go bankrupt and Cave eats up all the devs. But when we look at the DNA of horizontal games, none of these foundational shooters or vertical games have anything to do with this. There's not Xevious, there's not Galaga, there's not even Space Invaders. And it's really a bit messier, isn't it? There are three main texts for horizontal design: Gradius, Darius, and R-Type. And this is for a variety of reasons. In stage design, it's Gradius and R-Type. They inform the pacing in many games that follow. In formations and wave design, it's Gradius and Darius. This has a lot of influence on where and when enemy waves appear, as well as the types of bullet patterns that are effective for reading horizontally, especially on some bigger screens. And just the influence of Gradius' options load would take far too long to discuss, so I'm not going to do it, I'm not going to bother. They're in Cotton. Cotton's fairies are Gradius options. I'm talking about Cotton now, that's very important. Yet of all these games, R-Type is the most fully formed. The first Darius suffers from massive screen space issues, It's huge. It's cool in person, but there's too much wasted space. It's not worth it. And a lot of, Taito's actual major work comes in the 90s. It doesn't really happen in the 80s. I don't think Taito does anything in the someone will call me out. In the 80s, Taito, it was okay. 90s is when they got good. 91, they put out Metal Black. That was good, They put out Landmaker, 94? That was good. Darius Gaiden, 95. But that's the thing. It's if you think about every Rayforce was 91, 92? If you think about every Taito game that matters, it's all in the 90s. So, the first Darius, it matters, but it's not there. Gradius' gameplay, in 1, it's fine. It's there. The core concept is there, but 2 and 3 really, really pull it out. And so much of what we think of Gradius is in 2 and 3. It's not really in 1. I mean, the options are in 1. A lot of the tools are in 1. But when we think about what makes Gradius Gradius, it's 2 and 3. 2 and 3 cover that. So when we really think about it, the core concept of what is a horizontal game is R-Type. R-Type is pure. It's so good. Everybody copied it. This has an implication on a lot of horizontal games, in my opinion. In the Hunt's designer hated auto-scrolling, and he thought it shouldn't exist. So he made the IRM. IRM style in R-Type is already slow, and he decided to make it slower. And then we got Metal Slug. But what's important about all three of these games, and what makes them very different from vertical games, is that the way in which they use the screen space. Horizontal games, due to the screen being 4x3, not 3x4, as in vertical games, have a strong familial link to platformers and run and gun, almost to an incestuous degree, again, if you think of IRMs in The Hunt. The team left, they formed Nazca, and made Metal Slug. While Guwange carries a spiritual similarity to Ikari Warriors, Gunsmoke, or Outzone, a lot of vertical games remove themselves from these environments very quickly, because the screen space works in such a way that in order for more complex enemy formations and bullet patterns, especially the ones that Toaplan began putting out, obstacles and environments needed to be removed to allow for players to access the whole screen at all times. This is where we see our first major disconnect, because R-Type, Gradius, and Darius all employed terrain and obstacles from the beginning, most likely because that's how 4x3 screen space was being used in the beginning. Screen composition in games, it's no different than in art or film. On a screen, you want to maximize the effect of the space, and you want to place objects and parts of that space that make sense within that space. When you compose an image in 4x3 compared to a wider aspect ratio, 16:9, you have more headroom in 4x3, it accentuates verticality, whereas a wider ratio accentuates length. When you want to fill the screen, if you're going to use a wider aspect ratio, you're going to be using more landscape shots, more wider shots. This is why I don't really like, I actually deeply hate 16:9. I especially fighting games. There's no verticality that traditionally appears in fighting games in 4x3. And games end up being these linear lines where you just throw out pressure tools. So classic platforming and run and gun games use this to create that sense of verticality in platforming, and your eyes are more focused on the middle of the screen because of this. So we'll have a red guy, we have us, we're here. We'll have enemies that'll come in either from behind or they'll come from forward, but they'll come in these angles. Maybe they'll come down. They'll come into these angles that make sense for the screen. So when you think about how you read this screen, right? When I'm reading this screen, especially horizontal games, I'm not in the back at all that often, right? Because in these games, you're going to want to be more close to the center. You're going to want to think about, like, if all this stuff's coming up from this screen, maybe here, I want to be closer to here because with how bullet fall off works, right? You know, I only have a certain amount of bullets that I can be on screen at once. So I want to be, instead of here, I want to be here because I want it to be faster. In 3x4, you're drawn to the top and bottom of the screen because you notice the differences between the height versus the length. And vertical games use this when composing the screen because the designers know your eyes, they're less likely to be focused on the center of the screen and more towards the ends of it, the longer ends of it. And you know, this is a video about shmups, but I have to talk about Sonic. It's very important to talk about Sonic here. Sonic's complex. You know, despite how I'm gonna slam the table. Despite how we think of Sonic, that wasn't good. Despite how we think of Sonic now, Sonic 2 is not a game about going fast. Sonic 2 is about precise platforming, which is why Sonic has all kinds of like weird inertia to his movement, and takes like too long to start running. I think Mario runs faster than Sonic does in like Super Mario Bros. 3. There's more places where you go up or down in Sonic 2 than forward, because the screen space is designed around verticality. And making the game around the player running forward at max speed, it just causes them to run into an obstacle super fast, and it disorients them, because you know the Genesis is designed around 4x3. In comparison, the Game Boy Advance has a display ratio of 240x160, which is 3x2. It's a slightly more squashed ratio that makes it closer to widescreen. The Sonic Advance series is what we think Sonic is. You know, because we think Sonic is fast for some reason. The squashed screen resolution limits verticality, and it causes every stage to be designed more around moving from left to right. The game is designed around horizontality, around moving left to right. It's not really, there's no obstacles, there's no terrain changes. I don't think there's any enemies in that damn game. There's like one enemy that you can walk into. It's like a weird interactive movie with like less replay value than Dragon's Lair. You know, I don't get it. It's like a game you give to a kid with ADHD. And Sonic goes fast and he goes, whoa, that guy, I'm pressing right. What? Why am I talking about Sonic? I don't remember. Okay, it's not that R-Type at Gradius or Darius couldn't have been designed close to vertical games based on this pure Gallagher pattern routing. You know, it's just there's no reason to do it. You know, they're designed around different fundamental composition. When verticality gets involved and terrain or obstacles are being added, the ways in which enemies and bullets begin to be used is more akin to something like Contra. You know, where there are fewer enemies and bullets on the screen than in vertical games, but the challenge isn't the enemies and bullets themselves, but more relationship to the terrain. Where in vertical games, stage design is about creating flow, you know, one fluid motion as the player moves across the screen from objective to objective. Horizontal shooters are about disrupting flow. As in a platformer or run and gun, the enemies become obstacles in themselves, placed by designers precisely to mess with and take advantage of the player's position on the screen. Auto-scrolling in a shooter adds an extra sense of pace to the game compared to a platformer. You know, where the player's position is always in a state of flux. You know, they have to move around all the obstacles placed on the screen. This also leads to horizontal games being much more memo-heavy, as they're called, because playing by reacting generally, you know, it can put the player into checkmate positions with objects and obstacles, not just bullet patterns. So while it's stupid to say, like, Danmaku is not about memorization, you know, all shooters are about memorizing routing. routing is pure memorization. A lot of the design decisions in horizontal games require more upfront knowledge than Danmaku. Because the player not only has to know enemy and bullet routing, but they also need to know the stage layout. It's like Sonic. Oh, it's like Sonic. God, I think I've talked more about Sonic than R-Type in this video. The style of the original games hinges on the player knowing the different routes through the stage, and a player with more knowledge can take harder routes that offer extra rewards. Horizontal games, they're packed with all this upfront knowledge. That also means that memo games take longer to develop knowledge for, but become very simple to clear. Once you know everything, you can go through it. Even the most difficult games in the Memorizer canon, getting that initial knowledge radically changes the player's approach in such a way, they can clear a majority of the game without breaking a sweat. It's a lot different than a lot of the endurance runs for Danmaku games, which even with memorization, still challenge the player mechanically, or technically, or reactively in certain ways. This Sonic comparison I keep getting back to. Conceptually, someone who's a fan of Sonic can be a fan of Thunder Force 4. Like, there's the core design principles of these games have such a high degree of overlap, whether the game auto-scrolls or not. It doesn't matter. So for me, this very strong overlap is it's why horizontal games have been traditionally very mechanically distinct from vertical games. They use shield systems, they use life bars, because the main conceit of a horizontal game, the horizontal shooter is a gimmick. It's a platformer without platforming. And this concept of platformer without platforming, it sounds weird. I understand why it sounds weird, but when you think about it, in the context of horizontal shooters, this makes a lot of sense. It's like how run-and-gun games are platformers, but the platforming is not meant to be as precise. It's about moving around the platforms on the screen. The shooting is the main concept. The platforming just adds an element to it. In Metal Slug, platforming adds a little more depth than In the Hunt had, because In the Hunt was playing like a shooter still, even though it was in a different situation. It's different than a pure platformer, where a Metroid is a platformer where you shoot. Castlevania is a platformer where you attack, but these games are more built around platforming as the main thing, and then the attacking is what you do to defend yourself as you platform. And there's the weird mingling between all of these horizontal games, these horizontal systems. And I go back to why am I talking about Sonic so much? Sonic is useful to explain how horizontal design in 4x3 works, because, as I said before, Sonic is built around verticality. It's about many possible options, many possible ways of working in the system. Because, despite the name, the horizontal games, they employ a lot of this verticality I keep talking about. Since any game built around the 4-3 screen space comes from these really basic principles that were developed in the early 80s, games like Contra, Gradius, and Donkey Kong. Even though your screen is horizontal, quote-unquote, technically, in 4x3, your actual horizontal space is equivalent to your vertical space, and so you need to have an equal amount of horizontal to vertical to make the games feel like there's more to them than just a box. And many, especially as you get to the console games, you get to Technosoft games, Thunder Force, I'm talking about Thunder Force now, screens get bigger, there's more paths you can take, you're no longer bound to just the screen, you can make the screen move around. And that's because these horizontal games want to create more depth. They want to create more space than just what's on the screen. And horizontal games really were more perfect as extensions of platformers in this sense, A lot of horizontal games becoming console games is sort of the result of, we can put these games out, we can send them to the home, because it's a 4x3 space, so why not just send those ports out? You can port a 3x4 game, but you gotta have Tate mode, you gotta turn the TV around. But no one on the Mega Drive is gonna go Tate, no one on the SNES is gonna go Tate. So, port out those horizontal games first. That kid who loves Mario, you think there's overlap with him and someone who likes Raiden? I mean, he might like Raiden, but let's be honest, the kid plays Mario, he plays Contra, he's gonna play Raiden or Area 88. And Area 88 alone, it's probably the most perfect arcade game to ever port to console. Mechanically, it's got a health bar, it's got a store. This is the most SNES screaming game I've ever seen. And like this, many iconic Euroshmups are horizontal for a reason. I call them iconic ironically, of course, you know what I mean. But, many of the designers of these games, they were probably fans of platformers. I don't think it would be crazy to say all of the Amiga Euroshmup designers probably thought Turrican 2 was like the greatest game ever made. Wasn't going to talk originally about Euros in my script because I was just going to make a passing joke, like this Turrican thing was a joke, but then I remembered, this is why I come back to R-Type as this text, as the main text over Gradius and over Darius, is that Manfred Trenz, who was the designer of Turrican, and many consider one of the, he's one of the greatest game programmers for what he could do, and, he ported R-Type to the C64, and then he made a clone of it. And the reason why I specify that R-Type is so important and that these games are platformers without platforming is that you really look at the pacing of R-Type. The pacing is it's like Rondo of Blood. It's like this older style platforming where it's slow, methodical. There's a lot of enemies on the screen that you have to dodge around. R-Type to a degree could be partially responsible for the reason why Euroshmups have such a plodding pace. The shield mechanics and health bars and shops have other sources, but there's a certain quality to R-Type as a game that makes sense for people who are mostly console fans who love platforming games. And the way the stages are designed, the movement around the stages, the way the camera moves. Again, there's this overlap. Again, this thing. Why is it so important for me to reference that In the Hunt is R-Type without scrolling, and Metal Slug is In the Hunt but fully put into a running gun situation with platforming? This is incredibly important. These deal with the intentions of people who are more interested in stage design. The use of inertia in Euro games isn't really just that the ships should physically have inertia. I think a lot of, this got put into, a lot of shmup players' heads early on, because I think there was some smart-ass guy who was like, yeah, well, ships should have inertia, and it kind of tainted how we view them. But I view it differently. I feel like Euro shmups have inertia because the people who make Euro games like platformers. The platformers use inertia systems because floaty movement works for platforming. And a lot of these people who make these games, they prefer floatier movement. Whereas people who come from arcade systems, from the arcade environment, it's built around snappier movement. It's faster, it's instant, because you can't deal with that with a coin. You have to put a coin in a machine. You don't want to have God determine whether or not you live or die on this next life because of inertia. And speaking of that, we gotta talk about Euros. We gotta talk about these Euros. So just as, I've given you your texts for Don Mako and horizontal games, right? I've given you these texts. These games have texts. These are their own genre conventions that inform how people design these games. They decide based on the screen, based on how they want to work with them. We're gonna lump them to Umbrella, right? A majority of all of them, these twin stick shooters, they're not arcade games, these twin stick games, they're arcadey, right? They have bite-sized game loops, but they're all home computer or console games. They're made with different equipment and controllers in mind, and by people who prefer this floatier movement. And again, shmup players are we're gonna be like, oh, well, it's because people who play these, who make these games, they think that inertia is inherent because of physics. And it's no, the reason why, and this is really ignored. The real reason is because Asteroids is the text for the genre. And the entire design of Asteroids hinges on movement floating. That's the point. Asteroids uses 4x3 screen, focuses the player's eyes at the center of the screen, and because you rotate, the goal of the game is to maintain your position at the center. Because you have access to every corner of the screen to shoot the asteroids from that central position. However, because your movement is floaty, repositioning after dodging asteroids, if something flies at you, it means that it's harder to maintain that central position on the screen. So you'll always be in this state of flux, you're moving between the center, holding that position, and then when you shoot the asteroid and stuff flies off, you're gonna move, and then you move away from the center. And the further you are from the center in asteroids, the less ground you can hold, because you have to start moving more, and it's harder to maintain positions because you can't access all angles of the screen. So the core gameplay loop of Asteroids is no different than in Don Mako games. You go back and forth across the screen. In Asteroids, you move around this central position. It's a move between two poles. It's no different than the toe plan pattern conceptually. It's not Mushihime-sama. It's not perfect. It's really. it's conceptually, I think, very flawed, but I don't think it's, like, illogical. I think internally it makes sense to the game, and it makes sense on the screen, you know? Again, it makes sense, it's designed based on the screen. So it's a fine game, you know, I don't think we should be surprised that people want to make new Asteroids games. It's completely fine. I think it can exist. I'm not saying, like, people should buy Jets and Guns 2 because Asteroids is a solid game. I'm just saying, Asteroids ain't bad. I wouldn't pay more than $2 for Asteroids. I think I wouldn't pay for Asteroids. If someone made an Asteroids game, I wouldn't buy it. I'd pay $5. You know, I'd rather buy Jets and Guns 2 than buy Asteroids. I don't even want to buy Jets and Guns at all. I already bought Soldner X. I'm not buying Jets and Guns. And also, game journalists, if you're listening to this video, if you found my amazing video where I didn't talk about Thunder Force and I instead talked about Sonic 2, I talked about Sonic 2 more than R-Type. I didn't even name drop R-Type Delta. I'm name dropping R-Type Delta now. I talked about Sonic 2 and Sonic Advance 2. You know what I didn't say? I didn't talk about Ikaruga. Stop talking about Ikaruga. You know, horizontal games, we have our own Ikaruga. You can play it. It's called Einhander. You know, people who... You could play that game. You know, that's a game that people talk about without finishing. You could play Einhander. Talk about Einhander. Drop that stuff. So, I quoted that statement made by the Gradius developers in the intro. You know, if we're going to make an STG, let's surpass Xevious. No, but what does it mean to really surpass Xevious? You know, I mean, like, let's really think about this. Like, what is Xevious, right? Xevious is a game where you shoot. You shoot at both flying and grounded enemies. So what's the difficulty of the game loop in Xevious, right? The difficulty is switching between these things and routing them, right? Because they come from different positions on the screen. The flying things appear at different angles than the ground ones. So figuring out where and when you want to be on the screen, where you want to position yourself, that's Xevious, right? For the flying and the grounded units. Gradius is, in some way, an answer to Xevious. It sees what Xevious offers and responds with its own truth, unique answers to the problem of arcade gameplay. We're not only dealing with flying enemies, or just grounded enemies, but we're also dealing with terrain. And then there are these moments in the game where you can move the screen up and down, and there's this little platforming section. And in some sense, you know, all horizontal games have done that, because a good horizontal game flips the playfield. It alters the scope and changes what it means to be a shooting game. Because what really is a shooting game? R-Type, this example that I keep bringing in, it comes from Gradius. It's an extension of formula. It's an answer to this thing that Gradius has brought out. But it's so distinct from Raiden. You look at multiple games after the first R-Type came out. The R-Type formula is still there in R-Type 2 and 3. And then Raiden comes out in 90, and it's different. It's changing the game. R-Type is saying, we're methodical, we're slow, we're trying to play carefully around very complex situations. Raiden is, we're playing fast, we're going crazy. Bullets are cold and fast, you can't memorize this, you just have to dodge purely. They're both still shmups, right? So what does that mean, right? It's not a question of category. They both perform functions that say, I'm a shmup. It's in the same way, you know, Euro games ignore this, because they're ignoring the dialogue in arcade games. Arcade games are very simple things. You know, all horizontal games have technically surpassed Xevious. But it's not because that they're horizontal games with terrain. It's just that the reason why they've surpassed Xevious is that because in an arcade game, surpassing a game means that you're answering the question that it puts out. So an arcade game, when it puts out a question, you're kind of asking it's asking you, I've created these mechanics with these core game loops, and you need to now respond to this thing, because if you don't respond to it, that means that the arms race is over. I've won the arcade game. I'm gonna get all the coins now. And the horizontal game kind of flips the playfield. It kind of asks back the vertical game. It says, the scope is different. We're both shooting games. but I'm offering a dimension that you don't provide. And then the vertical game responds to the horizontal game by creating Danmaku. It creates bullet hell, and then the horizontal game's like, I can't compete.
お願い、私の星を助けて。